My very first woodworking project was a door very similar to this one, and that was exactly 1 year ago from the day that this video uploads. At the time, I didn't know anything about wood movement, so it warped pretty bad. Bad enough that it scraped the wall every time I opened and closed it, and bad enough that I knew I had to rebuild it, and here's how I did it. I picked up some 2x12 construction grade lumber from Home Depot, and same as what I used to build the first door, but this time, before I did any work to them, I stickered them and left them in my house for a few months to dry them out and get them acclimated to the conditions inside. I began the build by cross-cutting each piece down to a couple of inches longer than the final door width. You can use a cross-cut sled like I'm doing here, or use the miter saw or circular saw. As you can see here, these lumber were far from straight, and since they're too wide for my joiner, I used my hand plane to knock down the high points in each board until the board no longer rocked. This step doesn't need to be perfect. As long as all four corners are touching the workbench surface, they can be sent through the planer. Once both faces were flat, I used the joiner to get a straight edge that's perpendicular to the plane faces. Then I used that edge as reference to rip the boards down to their final width on the table saw. Here I used some quick setting epoxy to stabilize the knots and then smooth them out using my block plane. Once all the work's been done on the individual boards, I began laying them out to get the grains to match up so that a person won't be able to immediately tell it's made from 9 separate pieces of lumber. For joining the boards together, I went with dowels and used the same dowel jig as the one I used a year ago. This was actually the first Rockler product I ever purchased, and it's great for this application, and it's cheap. I have a link in the descriptions below if you'd like to get one. I worked on gluing 3 boards at a time, which is a lot less stressful than trying to glue everything at once. After clamping the boards together, I clamped some angle irons to the panels to keep things straight during the glue up. The method I use for keeping these panels flat over time is to mount some C-channels to the back of the door panels. I started out by cutting the C-channels to their appropriate lengths, and then I cut a few slots into them by drilling 2 holes next to each other, which allows the bolts to slide back and forth, compensating for the wood movement. Next, I used a router and a combination of a 1/4 inch bit and a 1.5 inch bit to route a groove which allows the C-channel to sit flush to the panels. Keep in mind that you'll want these grooves to be longer than the C-channel itself, which will allow the wood to expand and contract as the seasons change. Finally, I marked out and drilled holes in the panels for installing the threaded inserts and bolting the C-channels in place. And once the C-channels are mounted for all 3 panels, it's finally time to glue them together. After the glue has had some time to cure, I used my track saw to cut the door down to its final width. To give the door a more modern look, I put in some 1/8 inch aluminum plates. They serve no structural purpose like the C-channels, but I think these really add a lot to the overall aesthetics. And to keep it looking clean, I routed a groove to allow the aluminum plates to sit flush to the door face. drilled some slots in the aluminum plates so I could use bolts to hold them to the door. Instead of using the threaded inserts like I did for the C-channels earlier, I simply drilled and then tapped the wood to accept some 1/4 bolts I had left over from the crib I built a couple months ago. And it's not a bevelage project until I put some bevels somewhere, right? Actually, I just didn't like the obvious seam where the aluminum plates came together, so I used the V-groove bit and lined it up to where the plates met and cut a groove across the width of the door. And now that seam looks like a deliberate feature. And finally, I cut the panel down to the final length, flushing up everything and squaring up the corners. Here I'm spray painting the aluminum plates with some black spray paint. I also did this for the C-channels but couldn't find the footage for it. I should mention here that painting the C-channels is pretty important as it also helps to prevent rust and corrosion. While I waited for the paint to dry, I began to apply stain and finish to the door. First I applied some pre-stain, which is essential for staining soft wood like pine, so there's less of a chance for blotching. And for stain, I'm using some black walnut. And I finished it off with some water-based poly I had laying around. After everything's had some time to dry, I put everything back together and then began to install the door handle. This was the same handle I removed from the door I built last year, and I really like the way it goes with the black aluminum. I'll put a link in the description below if you're also looking for something similar. Lastly, I began to install the sliding door hardware. I won't go into much detail about this since it's a pretty straightforward process and the measurements will differ between manufacturers and door sizes. Also, I already had the rails installed from my build last year, so I won't have any footage of me installing that. So all I had to do was install the portion that goes on the door and then hang the door. I'd have to say that the most difficult part of this project was this moment, and it's just carrying this monster into the house and up the stairs. Definitely get someone to help you to avoid hurting your back and putting dents into the wall. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and feel inspired to go out and make something. If so, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button and let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, feel free to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with my latest videos. For more behind the scenes content, give me a follow on Instagram at Bevelish_creations, link in the description below, where I post regularly about what I'm working on, the tools I use, or just some fun shop content. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.